It's with great pleasure that I introduce Steve on his talk, Spiritual Science, How a Panspiritist Perspective Can Help Make Sense of the World. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. It's great to be here. Great to see so many familiar faces. I'd actually like to give this talk in memory of my father. My father died 2.5 weeks ago on October the 16th, so I'd like to give this talk and dedicate this talk to him. Although he didn't believe in life after death, he didn't believe in any spiritual nonsense, as he would have called it. But who knows? Who knows what he may be experiencing right now? Actually, funnily enough, 6 years ago, I was giving a talk in Brighton at a conference, and it was just after my father-in-law had died. And I said the same thing. I said, I'm going to give this talk in memory of my father-in-law, Ian Smith. And suddenly there was a big boom through the sound system. Boom! And everybody went, oh! And then I said, oh, wow, he didn't believe in life after death, but maybe he's experiencing something. And there was another big boom. So it was very strange. It was some kind of, almost as if it was some kind of after-death communication. But nothing from my father. Not yet. So we'll see. So, as Joan said, I'm going to give a presentation based on my recent book, Spiritual Science. I'm going to talk about a philosophy which I call Panspiritism. And I'm not surprised you've not heard the term before because I invented it. It's a new term. I actually thought, when I was thinking about these things, I thought that maybe it was a form of panpsychism. And I spoke to my friend who's a philosopher, a guy called Paul Marshall, and he said, no, this isn't panpsychism. You need a new term. So I thought about it and came up with the term Panspiritism. So I'll explain a bit later how it differs from panpsychism. It's similar, obviously, but there are certain essential differences as well. But I think the starting point of my approach is that we need a new paradigm of reality. We need a new philosophy to replace materialism. I mean, every culture needs a certain paradigm to make sense of reality, to explain the world and to explain our lives in the world. And probably since the second half of the 19th century, the basic paradigm, or the main paradigm of our culture has been materialism. But I think maybe we're at a point now where materialism is being superseded, and when materialism has to be superseded, maybe in order to ensure the continual existence of our species. So I think we're at a similar point now to the end of the 19th century. And it's important to remember that materialism is a belief system. A lot of materialists don't think that they're part of a belief system. They believe that they are dealing with facts. But a lot of the principles of materialism are just assumptions, as we all know. The assumption that matter is the primary thing in the universe, that all behavior and all phenomena can be explained in terms of the interactions of particles of matter. But yeah, it's quite funny that I went last summer of last year, I was invited to take part in a debate at the something called the Blue Dot Festival near Manchester, which is like a popular science festival. So I don't know why they invited me. I think it was some kind of mix-up. But they obviously didn't do a background check. But it was an interesting experience because I do love science. I love astronomy, physics. I love many areas of science. So many of the talks at the festival were interesting. But there was also a sense that there was a kind of belief system in the air. It was a bit like, reminded me of a sort of Christian boot camp or something like that. There was a sense that we possess the truth, and all those other people out there, all those people who believe in homeopathy and telepathy, all those kinds of nonsense, they're deluding themselves. That we possess the truth, and our mission is to convert other people to our way of thinking. So there was a strong sense of a belief system. And I think we are at a point now where many of the essential principles of materialism are being contradicted, many of the beliefs of materialism. And I think these are some of the areas that we need to address. These are some of the areas which materialism has been trying to focus on, to examine. These are some of the problems that materialism has been trying to solve. But it's becoming more and more evident that these phenomena cannot be explained in materialist terms. And there's a lot of discussion about consciousness. There always has been, certainly over the last 20 or 30 years. And materialism is definitely struggling to explain consciousness in terms of how the brain could possibly produce conscious experience. Also, the influence of the mind over the body, as evidenced by the placebo effect, Also altruism. Altruism, there are many sort of neo-Darwinian attempts to explain altruism, but none of them are particularly coherent or successful. And these are some of the areas I'm going to address in my talk this afternoon. I'm going to look at how materialism fails to explain these areas and how a panspiritist perspective can offer a more convincing explanation of these areas. So this is the core of my talk a bit later in a few minutes. I'm also going to hopefully have time for a short meditative exercise to demonstrate the panspiritist perspective. So I hope we'll have time for that. But I think, going back to materialism, I think there are probably 3 reasons why materialism needs to be superseded, and maybe reasons why materialism is being superseded. And the first reason is that materialism encourages a very nihilistic paradigm of reality. I think our culture as a whole is underpinned by a kind of nihilistic, consumerist perspective on reality. If you believe that we are simply biological machines and our consciousness is going to end when our brains and bodies end, if you believe there's really no purpose in our lives apart from to survive and reproduce, then it does lead to a nihilistic perspective. So what are we going to do? We're going to just have a good time, just watch television, go drinking, try and be as successful as we can, try and accumulate as many possessions as we can. These are the kind of nihilistic, consumerist end results of materialism. So I think you could say that materialism as a philosophy leads to materialism as a lifestyle. There's a very strong connection between the two. So we need a more sacred and a more meaningful perspective on reality to improve our lives as human beings, to give more meaning and purpose. I think as it is, the background of our culture is an existential vacuum, as the psychologist Viktor Frankl called it, a sense of basic purposelessness and meaninglessness. So I think the second reason why materialism needs to be superseded is because of the attitude to the environment that it promotes. So if you believe that living things are just biological machines, essentially, including other living beings, other human beings, and vegetation, and the earth itself, then it promotes an objectification of natural things. It promotes the idea that natural things are there for our utilitarian purpose, that they are there for us to take advantage of, to abuse and to use for our own devices. So obviously we need a more kind of sacred, spiritualized vision of the natural world in order to survive as a species. I think that materialist outlook is one of the core problems within our environmental issues at the moment. And finally, the third reason why I think materialism needs to be superseded, and maybe is being superseded, is because it doesn't actually explain the world very well. And this is where we come back to some of these areas here. Some of the essential elements of human experience, and some of the essential aspects of the world itself and of natural phenomena, are not explained coherently by a materialist perspective. I think that's becoming more and more evident, more and more evident as we go along. Even something like evolution. I think 20 years ago there was a lot of confidence about the kind of neo-Darwinist view of evolution. But there were lots of sort of more recent developments within biology which cast doubt on the kind of simplistic neo-Darwinian perspective. So yeah, these areas I'll come back to in a short while to look at them in more detail. So what are the possibilities? If we need to move beyond materialism, which I think we do, what are the possibilities? Are there any other metaphysical perspectives or worldviews that we can adopt? We don't necessarily want to return to a kind of simplistic religious outlook, religious stroke biblical view of reality. We need to move beyond, we need to move towards a post-materialist perspective. So here's one possible post-materialist perspective. I don't know if anybody was listening to the Today program on Radio 4, so you probably weren't because you were probably here. But in case any of you missed it, there was an interesting feature on panpsychism on Radio 4 yesterday. It was a conversation between Philip Pullman, the novelist, and Philip Goff, who is a panpsychist philosopher. So that kind of shows you that panpsychism is becoming popular. It's becoming mainstream, you could say. And I keep hearing stories or rumors about materialist scientists or philosophers who are becoming panpsychists. I don't know if you've heard these rumors, but I heard a rumor about Sam Harris, the American materialist or humanist. Apparently he has adopted panpsychism. And even Susan Blackmore, somebody was telling me that Susan Blackmore has adopted panpsychism, but I'm not sure about that. I think that's a stretch too far. So it makes you wonder who's going to be next. Maybe Richard Dawkins will be the next panpsychist. You never know. But in case you're not familiar with panpsychism, the basic idea, I guess it's quite the basic idea is quite simple. And it's that mind didn't need to emerge miraculously from matter. Consciousness did not need to emerge miraculously from physical forms, because it was always there. In every material particle, there's a tiny, flickering element of consciousness or sentience within every atom, every particle of matter. So it basically solves one of the big problems in philosophy about how mind could possibly emerge from matter. Because it didn't, it was always there right from the beginning. So you can see why, panpsychism is quite an attractive philosophy, an attractive alternative to materialism. But even though I respect panpsychists, I'm also I'm actually a little bit doubtful about not the value of panpsychism, but the extent to which panpsychism can actually explain the world. I think the explanatory range of panpsychism is quite limited. Beyond explaining how mind could emerge from matter, or how mind is related to matter, which is obviously quite a big question, which philosophers have been puzzling over for centuries, so I'm not going to belittle that issue. But it doesn't really address much beyond that. And also, one of the issues about panpsychism is that it doesn't explain how tiny atoms which have a flickering of consciousness within them, how those atoms could combine to produce larger conscious entities like human beings. That's sometimes called the combination problem of how tiny sentient atoms could combine to produce larger, intensely conscious beings. So I'm really looking for an alternative beyond panpsychism, and that's how I came to Panspiritism. And I'll explain the elements of Panspiritism in a moment. But I was thinking about this on the train this morning, and in addition to me explaining what Panspiritism is, it would maybe be a good idea for us to maybe experience something of what Panspiritism is. Or maybe I can just illustrate it with a kind of meditative experiment. So, are you happy to take part in a little thought experiment for a couple of minutes, sort of meditative experiment? Okay, so this will maybe take 3 or 4 minutes. It's just a way of illustrating what Panspiritism is and how it can relate to our experience as human beings. So, with your eyes closed, let's just relax for a moment. Just be aware of your breathing for a moment. Just be aware of the air entering and leaving your nose. Just pay attention to a couple more breaths. The sensation of the air brushing the inside of your nose. And now, after your next breath, let's bring our attention to our own mental space, to our own consciousness. So just be aware of your own conscious experience right now, with any thoughts that may be passing through your mind, any feelings or sensations. And also be aware of a sense of self, a sense of being somebody within your mental space, somebody who is associated with your thoughts and your experiences. And let's consider the source of this conscious experience which is passing through you, which you're aware of right now. From a materialist perspective, the source of your conscious experience is the brain. But let's consider an alternative idea. Let's consider the idea that consciousness, in its essential or pure form, actually exists beyond the brain, in the space around us, in the atmosphere around us. Let's imagine that consciousness is a field stretching around us, stretching through space. And that the role of the brain is not to produce consciousness, but to allow consciousness to flow into us as individuals. So the role of the brain is to be a receiver of consciousness, and then to transmit consciousness into our individual beings. Maybe you can sense that now. Maybe you can sense consciousness flowing into you from that source beyond the brain, from the field around us. Flowing into your individual being via the brain. So just sense that flow of your own personal consciousness from that source. And also be aware that all other human beings, all the people around us, all the people in the city outside this room, all of the living beings, consciousness is also flowing into them as individuals. The same source of essential consciousness is flowing into all of these individual channels. So that we are fundamentally connected to all of the human beings and all other living beings as channels of the same essential source. And when other living beings feel pain or joy or any emotion, we have the capacity to sense their experiences because we are connected to them, because we share the same essential consciousness. So just for a moment, be aware of that field of consciousness around us, flowing into our individual beings and into the beings of all other life forms. And now, for a moment, bring your attention back to your breathing, to the air flowing in and out. And when you're ready, let's slowly open our eyes again. So now I don't really need to explain what Panspiritism is, because I've given a kind of hopefully I've given an experiential illustration of what it is. But Panspiritism is the idea that consciousness is not just confined to material particles, or it's not just a product of the brain. It's actually an essential quality of the universe. And it's a quality which pervades the whole of space. And it pervades every object, every life form, and every natural object in the universe. And this fundamental consciousness, you could say also that it's the source of the universe. It's the origin of the universe. The universe flows out of fundamental consciousness. Well, let's use the word spirit. For me, fundamental consciousness and spirit are interchangeable terms. It depends on the audience I'm speaking to. If I'm speaking to a kind of skeptical academic audience, I'll use the term fundamental consciousness. Obviously, because it sounds a little bit more academically acceptable. But if I'm speaking to a more spiritual type audience, I'll use the term spirit. So let's just use the term spirit. So as that meditative exercise tried to suggest, our own individual consciousness is a channel or an influx, I like to use the word influx, of fundamental consciousness or spirit. So our own individual being is closely interconnected with fundamental consciousness or spirit, and also with every other living creature, because we're all manifestations of the same spirit. And according to Panspiritism, there are two essential stages in the development of the universe and of life forms. So the first stage was when matter emerged from spirit, which was when the universe came into being. And the next stage, which happened millions of years later, was when mind emerged within material things. So in my view, mind emerged within material things when a certain level of complexity was reached. Once material forms reached a certain level of organization and intricate complexity, they were able to channel or pick up fundamental consciousness and channel it into their own individual beings. And that happened basically with the first life forms. The first life forms, with a tiny degree of sentience, were the first internal influxes of spirit or of fundamental consciousness. And obviously, I'm talking about Panspiritism as a new philosophy, but obviously it's not a new philosophy. One of the things I've learned in psychology is that there are no new ideas in psychology. Every time I think of a new idea, I realize that William James thought of it before me, about 100 years ago. But even, William James, as you may know, he had a similar idea. He was the first psychologist, to my knowledge, or philosopher who talked about the transmission hypothesis, the transmission theory, that the brain exists to transmit a greater oceanic consciousness. But even before William James, thousands of years before William James, many of the world's indigenous peoples have similar terms. About 15 years ago, I wrote a book called The Fall, which is my first book. And I did a lot of anthropological research for The Fall. And one of the things which surprised me when I studied the world's indigenous peoples, reports from anthropologists and from indigenous peoples themselves, one of the things I found was that almost every indigenous people had a term for some kind of spiritual force which pervades the world or the universe. And here are some of the examples I picked up here. These are just a few. There are, I could give you 20 or 30 other examples. And some of them are very difficult to pronounce, very risky to pronounce as well. So I'm certainly not going to try to pronounce these two. But a lot of these peoples were not theistic in the sense we understand it. They didn't have images of deities. They had a more kind of spiritual stroke animistic perspective. And anthropologists have translated some of these terms as spirit, energy, universal soul. So they're not deities, they are a spiritual force which pervades all reality. And all living things are seen as manifestations of this spiritual force. And human beings themselves are also manifestations of this force. So there's a very strong interconnection between human beings, other living beings, and the whole of the world. All natural phenomena are seen as manifestations or expressions of this force. And this spirit energy pervades everything. So that's one of the reasons why many of the world's indigenous peoples were horrified when European colonists came along and, with their much more exploitative, objectified attitude to natural things. Because if you believe that spirit force pervades natural phenomena, then obviously you have a lot of respect. You see natural phenomena as sacred. So Panspiritism is really, my version of Panspiritism is a kind of contemporary version of this ancient worldview. I wouldn't say this is a philosophy from these indigenous peoples. I would say it's an experience. It wasn't really a conceptual view of reality. It was a basic experience of the world. So I guess what I've been trying to do is to use this perspective as an alternative to materialism, as a way of explaining some of the phenomena which materialism cannot explain. So I've mentioned consciousness already. As I said before, it's becoming more and more evident that the materialist perspective cannot explain consciousness. And I think that's why panpsychism is becoming more popular. That's why allegedly people like Sam Harris are becoming panpsychists. That's why we're talking about panpsychism on Radio 4. And I think one of the things that is becoming more evident is that there is no consistent and reliable relationship between conscious experience and brain activity. And we know this from near-death experiences and also certain examples of coma, when people are in a deep state of coma with very little neurological activity or physiological activity, and yet they have very high-intensity conscious experience. And obviously, in near-death experiences, there appears to be no measurable neurological activity or physiological activity. And yet, there is very high-level conscious activity, conscious experience. In some ways, it seems that the less neurological activity there is, the more consciousness there is, which is very strange when you think about it. So, as I suggested in the meditative experiment we did, Panspiritism suggests that consciousness is not produced by the brain. Consciousness is a fundamental quality of the universe, and the function of the brain is to receive and transmit consciousness into our own individual being. And materialists often say, well, consciousness must be produced by the brain because when the brain is damaged, consciousness is affected. If you take drugs, your consciousness is affected. But this doesn't really rule out the kind of hypothesis I'm putting forward, because obviously, you could take the example of a radio. If a radio is damaged, it may stop transmitting programs, but it doesn't mean that the radio produces the programs. Obviously, the damage to a transmitter will affect its output of information. So that's how Panspiritism would explain consciousness. I want you to think about altruism for a second. I mentioned altruism before. Actually, I want you to think about your own experience for a moment. I want you to consider, for 1 or 2 minutes, the last altruistic activity you performed. Hopefully it wasn't too long ago. But I want you to consider an altruistic act that you performed recently, or even one which was performed towards you. And consider your motivation for the altruistic act. I'm thinking about my own experience, and nothing is coming to mind. No. Actually, last night, I was coming back from Edinburgh to change stations at Preston, and there was a homeless guy outside a shop, and I decided to give him my granola bar. And, what was my motivation for giving the homeless guy my granola bar? Was I trying to look good in the eyes of other people? Was I trying to improve my own self-image by telling myself what a great guy I am? Was I trying to increase my reproductive possibilities? No comment about that one. Or was it some form of reciprocal altruism? Was I hoping for some favor in return? Maybe at some future point, maybe that homeless guy will return the favor in some way. Yeah, so think about that in the light of your own altruistic example. What was the motivation? Was it some kind of disguised self-interest? Was it the result of kin selection, which explains altruism as a strategy to help people who share the same genes or who are closely genetically related to us? So these are the traditional neo-Darwinian explanations of altruism, but I don't think any of them work very well, particularly when you explain altruism towards people to whom you're not genetically related, not closely genetically related, strangers, and also to animals. Recently I saved a spider from drowning in the bath by gently escorting it out of the bath. So why would I do that? It definitely was not kin selection, because I'm not genetically related to spiders, hopefully. So this is the Panspiritist perspective on altruism. I think altruism in its pure form, because obviously some instances of altruism may be the result of disguised self-interest. But I think altruism in its pure form is the result of the interconnection, the shared consciousness of living beings. And I try to illustrate that in the meditation. I try to suggest that because we share the same fundamental consciousness, we have the ability to sense the suffering of others. And I love this quote from Schopenhauer, who ironically was not a very altruistic person himself. He's quite a miserable, nasty guy. But I love this quote from him about altruism. He said that my inner being exists in every living creature as truly and immediately as in myself. This realization is the ground of compassion, whose expression is in every good deed. That's from his essay on the basis of morality. So I think he's right. I think that my inner being exists in you, in every other human being. My own inner being exists in every living creature on this planet. And that gives me the ability to sense other people's suffering and other living beings' suffering. And that can inspire altruistic acts. And I'll just mention one more. There are many, many different phenomena which I don't think materialism can explain, but which I think Panspiritism can offer a more coherent explanation of. I'll just give you one more example. I've done a lot of research. This is probably my main area of research, actually, on awakening experiences, or spiritual experiences, to use the traditional term. I use the term awakening experiences because these experiences tend to take place outside the context of spiritual traditions or religious traditions. They tend to be everyday experiences which take place in the midst of ordinary life. So this is the question I ask in my research. I may as well ask you this question now, actually, seeing as you're here. Have you ever had an awakening experience? That is, a temporary expansion and intensification of awareness. Yes, good. This could be an experience in which your surroundings have become intensely real, when you felt a sense of connection to them and a deep sense of well-being inside. Or perhaps you have felt a sense of harmony and meaning pervade the world, even a sense that all things are one and you are part of this oneness. So, hands up, who's had that type of experience? Good. Most people. Everybody apart from those who are looking at their mobile phones. That's why you're not having these experiences. You're not attending to the present moment. Anyway, here's a very brief example of one awakening experience which I collected recently. This is from a young guy. Well, he actually wasn't young. He was in his mid-50s, but he was describing an experience he had as a child when he was running out of his house in Glasgow to play with his friends. So suddenly, everything was pulsating with life and energy. I looked at myself. I was made up of the same pulsating energy. I looked up to the sky and just felt the oneness of everything, felt the earth spinning in its orbit. I melted into the ground, though this time everything looked as it would through normal vision, except for the aliveness and brightness and newness of everything. I apologize for the ill-fitting photo there. That was because I was told to cut my presentation short, so I actually cut out another experience, which was from a Vietnam vet who had a spiritual experience on the battlefield. But one of the characteristics of these experiences is a sense of oneness. There's a sense that all things are interconnected. All things are manifestations of something more fundamental than themselves. There's a sense that there's some kind of energy or spirit pervading the world. And there's also a sense that we are part of this oneness. We are connected to this oneness, as this guy describes so well. So obviously materialists have tried to explain spiritual experiences, but they haven't done very well. And there's been no, to my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong, but to my knowledge there's been no sort of coherent or viable attempt to explain spiritual experiences in terms of brain activity. So my view about spiritual experiences in Panspiritist terms is that they are encounters with the fundamental oneness of all things. So I think there is this, well, if you believe that there is this fundamental spirit or consciousness pervading everything, sometimes when our minds become very quiet, or when we have a sudden jolt into a different state of consciousness, then we tap into or we connect with this fundamental oneness. We see the oneness pervading the world around us, and we feel our own connection to this oneness. So that's what I think is happening in spiritual experiences or awakening experiences. And there's a few other phenomena which I don't have time to mention really, but as I mentioned evolution briefly before, that I don't think the neo-Darwinist view of evolution has validity anymore, and I think we need a new concept of evolution. But I wrote about that in my book, but obviously I don't have time to speak about it today. But just to finish, to conclude, as I mentioned earlier, I think we are at a critical point in our history as a culture. We are at a critical juncture in the history of the human race. And I think we are in a similar position to the people of the latter part of the 19th century when materialism took over from a Christian biblical perspective of reality. It was evident then that the Christian biblical perspective could not really explain human experience or the world around us. And now we're at a similar point where materialism can no longer explain the world around us, and materialism needs to be superseded by a new paradigm of reality. And I think that's happening already. Maybe slowly, but I think there are lots of encouraging signs that this is happening. And as I said before, I think it has to happen in order to ensure the future health and even survival of our species. The end point of materialism is ecological devastation and cultural nihilism. So if we are to avoid this predicament or the outcome, then we need to develop a new paradigm of reality. So I'd just like to end with a couple of my favorite quotes from the Upanishads, and these quotes illustrate the Panspiritive perspective very well. So we should consider that in the inner world, Brahman, or spirit, is consciousness. And we should consider that in the outer world, Brahman is space. A part of the infinite consciousness becomes our own finite consciousness. It is the source of creation and the universal in us all. The spirit is consciousness and gives, this spirit is consciousness and gives consciousness to the body. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Steve, for that absolutely excellent talk. I could connect with all of it. I still think that there's room for conversation about the difference between panpsychism and panspiritism, but I think that could be really useful conversation to have, and ultimately it's about the words psyche and spirit and what they mean related to each other. Anyway, we are kind of out of time, but rather than just move on completely, can we just take perhaps one fairly brief question from someone who's got a go on? I'll take you because your hand went straight up, so okay. Just this one, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. My question is, do you think this fundamental consciousness is self-aware? Because as you know, there's a struggle to define consciousness or human consciousness, and self-awareness is one of the criteria. Or do you think it finds self-awareness in the individual channels?
Yeah, I think the latter. I think in its essence, it is not self-aware. But when it flows into individual beings and becomes individual consciousness, then I think it does gain self-awareness. Mm-hmm.
Well, that was very quick.
Maybe it's time
great.
for another.
Yeah,
It's so
just
quick.
as it was so brief, can we have one equally brief one? That would be great. There's one over there.
It was just to pick up that point about, Steve, you used the word it of the consciousness. It is, as I think, what's the difference if we then move to saying it's an I? This kind of covers the previous thing. I just think that's a really significant moment. We either call it an it, or is it an I? Mm-hmm. If it's not an I, how can we attribute love to it? What meaning does it have to talk about love at that level of consciousness if there is no I? Because love has to be relational. And it can't be relational if there are no I's.
I don't agree, actually.
Sounds like a big one, is it, Steve?
Yeah. Well, let me just say that.
Do we put this
I
on
don't think
hold?
love needs to be relational. I think love is an essential fundamental quality. I think it is an aspect of spirit in its pure essential form. And love obviously exists in a relational form too, but it can also be, out of that context. Love, I think, is like bliss. It's an essential quality, fundamental quality of the universe.
Okay, thank you very much. And we will have time, hopefully, later on to come back to a few more questions and discussion. For now, can you just talk amongst yourself for a couple of minutes, because Urubu, musical movement, are just going to set up and we'll start in 2 or 3 minutes. Thank you.